acting in a crisis is necessary, but that's not what real courage is. Courage is acting before you have to act.
Hello, Greg. Thanks for coming on with us today.
Hey, Jeff, great to see you. Happy to be with you.
And thanks for having me on as well, Jeff and Greg.
Hey, Kaylin, great to see you. Great to be with you.
So, Greg, I got to interview you before when you did your Homeless is a Housing Problem book. You've got a follow up or you got another book out. So, what inspired you to write Affordable Housing in the United States and why now?
My colleague Rebecca Walter and I had been talking about writing a book on affordable housing for some time. And coincidentally, right, not too long after that book came out, we got an inbound inquiry from a publisher saying there's a need for an affordable housing book, initially framed as a textbook. And we expanded the scope to be not only a textbook, but also a resource for people who are trying to learn affordable housing 101. So it was kind of a combination of Rebecca's and my interest in this with an inbound inquiry and the end result is this new book.
Great. So, how'd your collaboration with Rebecca shape the direction of it?
Well, Rebecca and I teach together here at UW, and it was a great collaboration. She has a deep understanding of housing policy in the United States. She used to work with public housing authorities, and so and then I kind of bring a market lens to it. So it was a pretty good pairing from that perspective, and so then we kind of laid out what we wanted the book to accomplish, what audiences we want to reach, and then we kind of took different chapters. We each would draft the initial and hand them back and forth, and had a couple of great grad students that worked with us on data collection and some analysis, and we got to the finish line. Which I know you're a runner, Jeff, but I've done two of these, and it feels like mile 25, the marathon. When you get in there, you're just like, please, let's be done with this.
Yes, and your book challenges traditional notions of housing affordability. What's one myth you aim to dispel?
Well, I don't know that it's so much myth. I would say it's more of a definitional issue in the sense that if you were to ask people what affordable housing means, you'd get a whole bunch of different answers. And so we spend the front of the book just saying, like, what is affordable housing? And what we try to do is differentiate affordable housing from subsidized housing. It is true that in some cases, subsidized housing is affordable housing, but for some people, even subsidized housing isn't affordable. And then for some people, market rate housing is affordable. As we joke in the book, for Bill Gates, all housing is affordable. And so housing is a function of the resources that a household has. And so there are many ways that housing can be affordable. And so that's where we really try to position the book, is to get away from this usage of subsidized and affordable as synonymous, which I don't believe they are, but many people continue to use that. So that's one of the things that we really wanted to stress in this book.
Great. What did your research reveal about the most significant barriers to affordable housing in the U.S.?
Well, this is only a 10 or 15-minute conversation, but we could go on and on and on. I think the barriers are considerable. And I think what we try to highlight in the book is that they vary by geography. In the point that this is a national book, it's meant for a United States audience. But as we demonstrate in our case studies, the story in San Antonio is different than in Chicago, than in Seattle. And so the barriers in some places are rapid population growth and unable to keep up with it. Barriers in other places are declining population, substandard housing quality. How are we going to make sure that we have sufficient quality? Other places is restrictive zoning. Seattle, 75% zone single family. We need more multifamily zoning. How do we get from point A to point B? And so the reality is that any one of these things doesn't seem too insurmountable, but when you layer them all on top of each other, it becomes really difficult to get there. And then you've got a federal overlay, which has not been overly generous in terms of supporting people with lower incomes in terms of housing. And so you have that federal backdrop over 50 years combined with really challenging local dynamics, and you end up with a pretty significant affordable housing challenge throughout the United States, but it manifests itself a little differently in each jurisdiction.
Greg, so on future outlook and policy implications for your book here with Rebecca, the book outlines 4 potential futures for affordable housing in the U.S. Which path do you think is most likely, and why?
Well, it's funny that you asked that. So one of the reason that we structured our path forward chapter in that way was my frustration, and I read a lot of policy focused books, not just in housing, but in other domains, is that people will write these final chapters saying, this is what the world should look like. And I read these chapters saying, you're right. And there's 0% chance of that actually happening. And so to a certain extent, there's a lot of time and energy that goes into these completely implausible scenarios. And I think there's a role for dreaming and for ambition. And so I don't want to shelve that completely. But to me, if there's no link between pragmatism and realism with this outcome, to me, it undermines the effectiveness of the policy focused portion of the book. And so what we tried to do was say that there are decisions that are going to be made at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level that will determine the state in which we find ourselves. And we go from status quo to incremental change to more substantive change to kind of really a reordering of the housing system in the United States, where we start to think about housing as a human right and, you know, mimicking other advanced economies like Northern Europe, for example, where housing is dealt with very differently. And so there are many people might say that's an ideal that we're shooting for. I think the likelihood of that happening in the United States is pretty low and very remote. And so the idea was to kind of frame how this might look in different states. And so I feel good about that contribution. I think the critique that we're kind of laughing at ourselves about right now is that we didn't really consider, our base case was status quo. What we didn't really anticipate was a retrenchment. And what we're seeing now in the current budget proposal that passed the House was a pretty radical reduction in HUD's budget. And so, at least for the next couple of years, the risk is that the status quo state that we outlined might be pretty ambitious. And in fact, we might be in a state zero or retrenchment case where our already pretty limited federal supports for housing are cut by potentially up to 40%, which is what the budget is saying. And so I think if we're talking in the near medium term, Kalen, I think we're looking at status quo or potentially even a reduction in the status quo in terms of supports. And then I think the question is really a political one of what does it look like over the next 10 or 20 years? And I think there are a lot of things that are going to go into who we elect and what policies they decide to pursue. I do think the more ambitious changes I think are highly, highly unlikely, which is why I wanted to include them and honor that as an ideal, because I do think having a more robust system of publicly supported housing would be good for society. It's not without its challenges, but I do think it would be good for society. I think the likelihood of that happening is pretty low, and I am a pragmatist, so I wanted to honor that.
Okay, so then that recognizing that the present is now has introduced this retrenchment possibility.
Yep.
That probably changes what you would now answer the immediate policy change that you think could make the most significant impact on housing affordability today. What do you think that would be? It's probably different from maybe 6 months ago or 9 months ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've been on a series of calls today with folks in our region who are scrambling to figure out what's going to happen if we lose this federal support. Mm-hmm. And so if you were asked me today at 2:42 Pacific time, I would say holding on to what we have right now would be my wish if I had a magic wand, because I do think the consequences for our region are going to be considerable if these pretty drastic cuts go through. And so 6 months ago, I would not have been beating my chest on just keeping what we have. I would have hopefully been more ambitious. So at a federal level, I think holding on to what we have over the next couple of years will be really important, and hopefully through the budget making process and that sausage making process that we can hold on to those pretty limited supports. What I think is important, though, is independent of what's happening in Washington, D.C., there still is an opportunity for the state of Washington and King County and the city of Seattle to make progress. And that can't stop. And so I'm very hopeful that the new governor, and we're going to have a new county exec in King County, and Mayor Harrell and his administration continue to emphasize housing. And that's not only subsidizing housing, but also thinking about how do we make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing. We need to make it way easiasier for private developers to build more housing because we need a lot of units. Our region needs 880,000 units over, I think, the next 20 years, according to the Puget Sound Regional Council. It's either 20 or 25, but the point is it's a big number. And we're not going to get there by arguing over every 100 unit development. Yeah. Right. We need to start thinking at a bigger scale. And so we need to have a regulatory framework that will facilitate that. That doesn't mean that we can't build good housing. It doesn't mean that we can't be good stewards of the environment, but we can do that and build this housing. And so while we're worrying about things in DC and potential cuts that can be difficult for households, I still believe we can and should be moving the ball forward locally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you asked for one thing and I gave you like 30. So just
no, great. That's fantastic. For personal perspective, how has your perspective changed on housing in the research in writing this book. You know, it's probably a bit of a layering from all of your other experiences.
Yeah, I guess, I wrote the history chapter in the book, and I guess, and I've known this because I've been teaching, and studying housing policy history for a long time. But when forced to sit down and write it, it really speaks to that many of the challenges that we're dealing with right now are not challenges that have emerged in the last 5 years or 10 years, right? We have structured systems over the last couple hundred years in the United States that have produced the outcomes that we're seeing, and there are moments in the road where we took a turn to the left or the right. I don't mean that politically, but just we've made decisions, and those have had consequences. We decided to build a bunch of housing after World War II in the 1970s. We decided we don't like that anymore. We want to do vouchers. 1986, we decided to do tax credits. Fine. But what we see right now is the effect of those decisions that have been made. What we see in Washington over the last 25 years is a booming economy. If you think back to my relatives moved, one branch of my family moved here in 1979. My cousins were in elementary school, and I remember coming out here in 1979. They built a house in Bellevue, there was nothing there. I remember running around the streets of Bellevue, and there were just empty lots everywhere. Yeah. And if you think about when my cousins moved here in 79 to 2025, the change in this region is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about this growth that has been pretty rapid, and the collective failure of our state and communities to respond to that growth with adequate housing, that really, really strikes me when you kind of look at what's happened here. And so when I travel around the country, what I say is, learn from our mistakes. Growth and prosperity is good. I think most people in Washington are grateful that we have a strong and thriving economy, and that we've got good jobs and people are well compensated. Most people, not all. That's a good thing. But what we didn't do is pair that with sufficient housing growth. And that's had a big consequence for all of us, whether you're looking to buy a house or rent or trying to get off of Third Avenue if you're homeless, And so I think that's what I really take away is kind of the long trajectory. And so if you're a leader, whether you're running a business or you're advocating or a policymaker, like the things that you're doing now have a long tail to them, right? The housing that people build, people are going to be living in that housing for a long time. And that's a great privilege and an honor because it's a huge contribution to society. But we get pretty narrowly focused from a time perspective. And the reality is that there's a long span of time here that has big implications.
If you could directly address city planners and policymakers reading the book, not just locally, but nationally, what would you say to them?
Well, what I say to folks in the Midwest when I'm there is their housing markets are tightening dramatically, is do not wait 10 years to act. Mm-hmm. We are acting now in the state of Washington. I'm grateful that we are. We're acting in the state of California. Thank goodness. We waited too long. We waited until the crisis got to a level that was too severe, and it's really hard to get out of it. And so what I say to elected leaders, planners, et cetera, I was in Missouri 2 weeks ago, was in Green Bay and a month ago. Acting in a crisis is necessary, but that's not what real courage is. Courage is acting before you have to act. Mm-hmm. For the most part, the major policies that we've made in the United States have happened during wars, during depressions, and during pandemics. Mm-hmm. It's really pretty remarkable, or times of significant unrest, late 60s, for example. What we don't have is major policy achievements in kind of when things are humming along, because at that point, people don't want to rock the boat. And so the problem is that kind of sailing was smooth, in Seattle and in King County for a long time here, things were humming along. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got a real problem. Mm-hmm. Would have been awesome if in 2005, 10, 12, we just said, boy, look what's coming. We really, really need to change our trajectory from a planning perspective and from a policy perspective. And so, to a certain extent, our region can be used as a case study of we did a lot of things great, but we didn't do everything great, and other jurisdictions can learn from that. Mm-hmm. And that's hard. And I'm not suggesting it's easy for me to say it's hard to do, but kind of getting out in front of these problems is, to me, what real leadership is all about. Yeah,
it sounds like in places that aren't experiencing what we have on the West Coast and on the East Coast, it doesn't mean that the middle of the country is immune from what's going on.
Not at all.
And that's
not at all.
You said. I've heard you say that a couple of times now, and right on. on your background, could you share a bit about how you got involved with the UW real estate program and a little bit of your story?
Yeah, so I'm a second career academic. I had a first career in finance. I was an investment banker and private equity investor, and I did that for about 17 years, and then was about to turn 40 and had had enough and quit, and went and got my PhD in public policy and focused on housing policy. I have a passion for housing. I just think it's important, and had always wanted to be a college professor, and was fortunate enough at the conclusion of my PhD studies to land a position at UW. And when the Runstead Department of Real Estate became a department officially in 2017. And so Arthur, Rebecca, and I were fortunate enough to join the department at that point, and have had a great 8-year run and worked with a lot of awesome students like you all, and got to work on a lot of interesting research and engage with policymakers and leaders here in our community, developers, you name it. So that's kind of how I ended up here, and it's been a really interesting. I've learned a ton since being here from all the folks that I've interacted with, and hopefully have made a contribution in my time here.
Oh, you have. And I can remember. I remember taking your class in financial modeling, and it's still. I go back to it. Another thing, another great instructor, Tim Overland in the department, would always tell us something like, if you remember just one thing this quarter, it would be this. But what I found out was he said it almost every other class. So now I've adopted to say, if the students remember just one thing I say from any day they take with them, and try and put it out there. So I ask my guests, if they have one thing, it could be a recipe, a bumper sticker, but if you could leave students with, or policymakers, whichever, if you just have one thing you hope people remember from your book or your real estate background, do you have a bit of advice you might share?
It's funny. I had a friend send me something this weekend, which was someone had made a shirt that said "Make housing affordable again," and so I was like, I think I want to get that shirt. And so I really think that a lot of our challenges in society right now is that we don't have housing that's affordable for so many people, and it's creating all sorts of challenges. And I want housing for people who are living on the street. I want school teachers in Seattle to be able to live in Seattle. I want firefighters in Seattle to be able to live in Seattle. And that's just not happening right now. So if we could, as a society, make housing affordable again, I would be all for that. So I guess that's my bumper sticker.
Great. Well, with your book, and I've got your book here too. So obviously it's it's on my summer read. As soon as I get grading done, I will start reading it. What's a book that has impacted you, that someone else has written, that has made an impact on your life?
I would say in the housing realm, a book that really had an impact on me was the book Evicted, which was written by Matthew Desmond, who's now at Princeton, was at Harvard at the time. And Evicted was really his way of telling the story of housing precarity, in this case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it talked about the personal stories of people who've been evicted. And it's a great read if people haven't, it's a bestseller. And so a lot of people have already read the book. Why it was impactful to me, not only just the content and the story, which was compelling, and Matthew's a really a compelling writer, but how it impacted me was it was the first book written by a professor that I saw that really had a material impact outside of the academy. And so when I was conceptualizing my first book, I had that in the back of my mind of, I want to make sure that this is something that people are ideally reading and talking about who are not just professors. And so I wrote with that intent. And what's amazing is last year I got an email randomly from Matthew Desmond. He said, "Hey, I just read your book. I really like it. Would you talk to my class at Princeton?" And so I zoomed in and spoke to his class, which was a real honor, because it's like, if you're a basketball player, it's like having Michael Jordan reach out to you. So that was really affirming for me, and a real honor. And I told him how much that book meant to me, and how it informed the way that I wrote that first book. So that was kind of a cool experience.
Good. So if people want to get in contact with you, learn more about the book, how do they get it? How do people reach out or connect with you?
Well, the book is available on Amazon, so it's probably the easiest place to get it. And if people want to reach me, they can just Google Gregg Colburn, University of Washington, and my faculty page will pop up, and they can send me an email, as many people do, with their praises and grievances about my work. So I've got a very active inbox. So fire away.
And I heard another interview you did with someone else. You have a whole a folder in your inbox for certain emails that may come in, because I think your other book may have raised some ire with some people. But overall, Gregg, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
My pleasure. Great to see both of you.